some kind of compromise. It's a thing that people probably from all walks of life have had to deal with at some point. Whether it's from the hand that we have to deal with in the present, or whether it's for our future and the concerns about what may happen, or whether it's from our past and all the baggage that comes with it. In today's Bible discussion, this is also the topic we will talk about in the book of 2 Kings, and the downfall of Israel's two kings of the north and the south, and their exile out of the land promised to them. Hi everyone, this is Tammy Becker. Welcome to 2 Kings book review of the Bible, and we're going to jump right in. Glad you're here. So like the previous books before, the book of 1 Kings belongs to a series of books labeled as history. And 1 Kings is the 7th out of 12 books in the series and the 12th overall in the rest of the Old Testament. So a little review is that the main difference from the earlier books, the first 5 books, which are called the Torah books, is quite important. History is important to us. So the Torah books from Genesis to Deuteronomy detailed the promise of salvation that God made to Abraham and his descendants, and the long journey towards the promised land and the formation of the sacred commandments. Now the book of history, however, starts with the arrival of the people in the promised land and the challenge to bring the promise of God's grace towards the other nations that seek salvation outside of the tribe of Israel. So the author of 2 Kings, like the book of 1 Kings, the author is unknown. Although many people want to speculate, including scholars, that it was probably likely that someone well-versed in the history of Israel, like the Israel's people, likely would have wrote it. So the interpretation seems to have been that only persons who were familiar with the history would be able to write such an extensive account. So the title of 1 Kings and 2 Kings refers to a long story told in 2 parts. 2 Kings refers to the second and the last part. This is because, of course, the scroll length of the book of Kings in general, it was similar to the book of Samuel, and so many choose to divide the discussion. Also, like the book of Samuel, both the first part and the second part talk about the societal and political problems that the people of Israel faced after Israel's judges. But they're the main difference between this book and the book of Samuel. The book of Samuel showcased the promise of the Messianic king from King David's family line, who was considered a good king, even though David himself was not perfect. Now, the book of Kings, in contrast, makes a full turn backwards and showcases a list of kings that came after David with personalities that were like that of the tribal judges before. Now, in the second book of Kings, it talks about the people in the split kingdoms and the eventual downfall that came after. The main people we're going to discuss in the book of 2 Kings are quite important, and it's split into 2 camps, so to say. So, namely the people of Israel, which was the northern kingdom and capital of Samaria, Elisha and Jehu, and Jeroboam II, and people of Judah in the southern kingdom with the capital of Jerusalem, Joash, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Isaiah, Manasseh, Josiah. That was a mouthful. So the general outline of the book of 2 Kings, it covers around 200 years of history after the people were split into the two different kingdoms. So the events cover the ministry of Elijah and eventually the ministry of Elijah, a disciple. Eventually, the book talks about the downfall of the split kingdoms, both north and south, Israel and Judah. Now we begin 2 Kings with the importance of God's prophets, particularly the prophet Elijah and Elisha. Over the years, the prophet Elijah had been the messenger of God against the northern kingdom's wicked king Ahab and his wife Jezebel. Now Ahab, like much of the northern kings, praised idols. Throughout this confrontation, Elijah had made plenty of miracles and warnings to persuade Ahab to stay faithful to God. But with many of the conflicts, Ahab died in battle back in 1 Kings. So in chapters 1 and 2 of 2 Kings, we find a set of different kings in the years after that. So the prophet Elijah was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind and left the work to his disciple, in turn prophet Elisha. And then King Ahaziah had died and was replaced by his brother Jehoram and the throne. Now the northern kingdom of Israel had a new prophet and a new king. We head into chapter 3 where we see kings of both the Israel, the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern kingdom, and Edom fight together with the enemies of Moab. And Elijah would give these kings the instructions from God. Throughout this, Elijah would perform some acts to help the people. And then in chapters 4 through 7, he helped a widow pay money that she owed to someone. He asked God to bring back a woman's son from the dead. He also asked God to instruct the Aramean commander Naaman so that the commander may cure his leprosy. Now at this point, Elisha became a prophet that took to the duties of God's message to the kings and people across the two kingdoms. But eventually, in chapter 8, it was a king from the northern kingdom of Israel that things began to fall apart. Elisha had anointed Jehu to become the king of Israel under God. We have to recall that between the two kingdoms, the king of the northern kingdom and Israel were not obedient to God and often worshiped false idols. So Jehu would eventually seek justice and kill those who worshiped the false god Baal. But this wasn't enough for Jehu. In chapters 9 and 10, Jehu eventually wreaked violence into the former king Ahab's family and even killed Ahab's wife Jezebel. Then Jehu killed those who remained loyal to the family of Ahab too. And it may sound like Jehu sought was the right to exact God's justice over the idol worship that had been common in the northern kingdom after the split. This was not what God had obeyed though. Under God, Jehu was promised rule over the northern kingdom of Israel for 4 generations. Now, Jehu overstepped his authority with violence and so was owed violence in return. That was the ways. The kings that succeeded after Jehu in the north would eventually fall to Jehu's standards, from Zechariah to Shallum and Menahem to Pekahiah and Pekah and Hosea. All who succeeded Jehu committed further violence, assassinations, coups, and injustices. And some even went back to the adultery. So in the discoveries from the past during this time, a stone was found in the place of Nero, an Assyrian city, that showed that Jehu, an Israelite king, kneel before an Assyrian emperor. Though this isn't described in 2 Kings, research has speculated this is a tribute of gifts and gestures. This is especially true when Israel at the time was at war with a common enemy, Syria. This constant agenda of violence among the northern kingdom kings would contribute to its fall. The Assyrians, ironically, would eventually storm down to the northern kingdom's capital, Samaria, and overpower it. In chapter 11, over in the southern kingdom of Judah, we seemingly find a different story. We find that Joash, the son of King Ahaziah, only vaguely related to King Ahaziah of the fallen northern kingdom. Joash is hidden from his wicked grandmother Athaliah, who wants the throne of Judah. So fortunately, the wicked Athaliah was killed when Joash was crowned king, and Joash seemingly put his kingly role to good use. As we head into chapter 12, we now find out that Joash, or Jehoash, was called to repair the temple of God after the fall of Solomon and David. Compared to the northern kingdom, this was a blessing. But the armies of Aram, Syria, eventually threatened King Joash, and it was Joash would give them back the treasures of the temple and from the palace. So Joash was eventually killed and succeeded by his son. So in chapters 13 through 17, we find that the northern kingdom of Israel is at its heels and prayed to idols all around for favors. They were sons and daughters of a king in David, and not a perfect king, but a good king. The people of the northern kingdom have not been of David's lines, but they were part of Jerusalem. Ever since the split, they have become idolatrous and unfaithful to God's covenant. And in chapter 17, we find the might of the Syrian army corner the northern kingdom of Israel and its capital, Samaria, into submission. Most of the people in the kingdom had been held captive in Assyrian Empire, and some had been made to exile out into the ancient world. God gave them the choice to observe the covenant, but their kings and thus their people chose something else. Thus, God made them confront the results of their decisions that they made. The northern kingdom of Israel was no more. So it was good then that some of the kings in the southern kingdom of Judah made a point not to replicate this. In chapters 18, we find that those in King Hezekiah and Hezekiah, for example, had refused to worship the false idols and destroyed those idols that were in place in different areas. And he refused to bow down to the king of Assyria. Hezekiah would observe and respect the covenant that God set out for the people since the time of Abraham. Even when the Assyrians would corner the kingdom of Judah round, God would send out an angel to kill the Assyrian army at night. And then it helped that the prophet Isaiah was there and provided Hezekiah with God's guidance to confront the Assyrians. Even in sickness, Hezekiah would remain faithful and pray to God to heal him. And so God healed Hezekiah. As with the kings of the past, even with a good king like Hezekiah, the prophet Isaiah warned him that though he was to heal from the sickness, the kingdom of Judah would get exiled unto a place called Babylon. In chapters 21, oh, Babylon. I'll tell you. The exile would begin after Hezekiah's death with the reign of his son Manasseh. And Manasseh was said to have been the evilest of the Judah's kings. So Manasseh not only brought back adultery, but he brought back child sacrifice too. He would influence his son Amon to also worship the idols and become just as bad as his father. Some people had enough and had Amon killed, and eventually the people would crown their next king, Josiah. And at 8 years old, he was crowned king. 8 years old. So God can choose anyone, whether you're young or you're old. So Josiah would prove, as Hezekiah saw before him, that he was a good king. So in chapters 22, we see that Josiah repaired the temple in Judah from near ruin and found the scroll of the Torah, the Bible law, which contained the commandments of God. So throughout these years, Josiah was saddened that he and the people had not observed the laws of God had set before them. What's happening nowadays? It's the same thing. So into chapter 23 we head. Josiah spoke to the people and asked them to join in and obey the covenant that God had sent to them. The promise of grace that was made to Abraham and the blessing that Moses asked to the people to choose. Josiah then continued to destroy the idols and those that would take the people out of the covenant. For a long time, the laws of God that Moses had set forth back in Deuteronomy had come to light in a king. But the people and the histories upon histories of judges and the kings, even the good ones, was too much. It was way too much. It seemed though it was too late. In chapters 24 and chapters 25, we see the Assyrians come down unto Judah and Jerusalem and disseminated the place. They destroyed the temple, took their items of worship. They took the gold from the palace. They captured the line of David and exiled them unto the prophesied city of Babylon. And they left the poor. As with the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah fell, though kings in the line of David made a point to reverse the course of their past. The prophet Moses asked them to choose the blessing over the curse, but they had chosen otherwise. They were too far gone, it seemed. What exactly would await the captives of Judah and the line of David behind the great city walls of Babylon? That will have to be for another time. In our next episode, when we head in for our next episode that will drop next Wednesday, in our reflection today, we come back after a long time to what Moses said to the people of Israel. And we come back to the truth behind its message: life and death, blessings and a curse. And so he asked us to choose life. For us to see that God's promises had always been clear and had always been fair. The covenant was there and were the prophets that spoke of the covenant. For whatever reason, that wasn't the king of Israel, except for a few had chosen. So their kingdom fell and the promised land was taken from the people of Israel. Their whole world crashed down to the ground. This is what Moses feared would happen. Moses probably wanted to scream at the young generation of Israelites and get it to their heads about what was going on. The message to not pass on the baggage unto those who came after. To not have the sins of the father of any parent to fall on their children. pride and all. It's a truth that impacts us after all. Parents and child, teacher and student, older and younger. But Moses didn't scream. And he didn't scream because he probably realized when he wasn't permitted to travel to the promised land. I hope that you have enjoyed this and the people of Israel, what we're going through, and understand that the people of Israel, grace and all, were only human. We are only human. We have had to make some kind of compromise in this world, and some compromises we like and some we regret. So all in the desires and wishes that these compromises would in some sense make us happy or acknowledged, right? When it doesn't make us all more lost. That's the key. Or even exiled. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be exiled. But this is like why it is so very beautiful that Jesus Christ extended his hand over to us. This, Jesus knew, was what we needed. What we need, love without compromise. That is the great patience he waits for us to realize that though we are compromised everywhere else, we are not compromised to him. This is true, especially in the times when you are lost and put yourself in exile. When you feel the world has crashed down, remind yourself that though we may compromise on other things in life, we cannot compromise. Do not compromise on Jesus Christ and his hope, his love, and faith that we are worthy of redemption and salvation. That's what matters. Carry that with you always. I hope you enjoyed this episode. To see us back here next Wednesday, make sure and check us out on the website at www.yoluministries.com, where you can purchase a course for a donation, get a tax receipt because we are a nonprofit, and that purchase buys a Bible and puts it in someone's hands, or a meal, or some clothes. So get on over there and check that out, and join us in our private Facebook group, Girl Read Your Bible, where we study the Bible together, and then come back here after we have studied all week and do the review video and share it with your friends. So don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit my bell, and I will see you back here next Wednesday. I'm Tammy Becker. See you next time. Bye.